So we're so excited to have Rob Bilott, the author of Exposure, Poisoned Water, Corporate Greed, and One Lawyer's 20-Year Battle Against DuPont. We have an amazing panel as well, and I'll introduce them very shortly. For all you trial lawyers from around the country who bought the book, put in the time to read it, and then showed up tonight, we're committed to making sure your time was well spent and that this will make you a better lawyer. For those of you who aren't lawyers, welcome also. If you have questions, please post them and I'll try to get to them. Sometimes we can even bring you on and ask them yourself. So let me explain how we're going to do that today. If you post a question in the chat or in the Q&A, raise your hand if you'd like to come on to the video, if we can get to it. I can't promise that, but if you're interested in appearing on the video, raise your hand. I know some of you aren't prepared for us to suddenly turn the video on, depending on what you're doing. Don't forget, in about a half hour, we'll bring on our bartender to teach us in only 4 minutes a new drink. And we've put a link to the cocktail recipe in the chat if you want to get started before then or get the ingredients ready. So let's get at it. Anyone who's read Exposure understands Rob, understands the kind of lawyer, the kind of person that he is. I first heard of him when I read a New York Times Magazine article. It was a long time ago, but I remember how much I loved the title, The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare. Later, I read Rob's amazing book. I saw the movie about his life. For those of you who haven't finished the book yet, he discovered and exposed the dangers and the worldwide impact of environmental contamination from PFAS chemicals, these forever chemicals. He was not only an amazing lawyer, he made great sacrifices. I'm sure he eventually recovered over $1 billion for his clients, but his book helps us see the long struggle, the long and sometimes lonely struggle and the sacrifice. So Rob, welcome. I'm sure you've been told this many times, but I have to say it also. You're a true hero. You're an inspiration to lawyers and you've made the world a better place.
Well, thanks so much. Really an honor to be here and thanks for having me tonight.
Absolutely. So if you don't mind, I want to ask a few questions before we get into the case and the details of your lawyering. I just want to talk to you about the book and the writing of the book. Why did you decide to write a book?
You know, it was about the time that we were finally getting some of these cases to trial and laying all the facts out about what had happened and laying, spending weeks in front of juries, laying all this out, letting them see what had happened. And the story was finally getting told and was finally being understood by the juries who were getting it. And they were holding DuPont liable. Yet this story about the extent of the public health threat here wasn't getting out to the rest of the public. And, we were dealing with something that wasn't just impacting the community along the Ohio River where our folks that were taking these cases to trial were from. This chemical we were dealing with was in drinking water all over the planet, frankly, in the blood of everybody all over the planet. Yet nobody still was knowing about it. The article had come out in the New York Times, but really nobody understood the scope of what we were dealing with. And I was still seeing these companies stand up and in public forum say that there had never been any science that had ever been done that linked these chemicals with any harm in any human at any dose, just denying all of the science and everything we had done. So I really wanted to find a way to put the facts out there, put this story out, let people see for themselves what did actually happen, the science that does actually exist, and all of the work that community along the Ohio River had put in for 20 years to get this story out. So I wanted to have all of that in a format that people could access themselves and see for themselves what really happened.
Yeah, so I never thought about that. Writing the book was part of how you made the change that you did. This is one of those cases, and we'll get to this in a minute, but it really is where you have to stop and think if there was one lawyer, you, who wasn't on this case, how would things have gone differently? Not only in the case, but for all of us in our safety and in these chemicals. So, but we'll get to that in a little bit. We have some questions on some of the decisions you made. And um, that's why you decided to write the book. People who come on, subscribe to the Top Shelf and come to every session know that I think it's very hard for lawyers to write a good book. For some reason, lawyers write a lot of bad books. Maybe it's law school or something. But this, it really is great. It's really so interesting. Can you give us any insight into how you wrote an interesting book with the disability of being a lawyer?
I had a great editor and great publisher and folks I was working with that helped me through that process. Because as you say, we're trained as lawyers to write a certain way, and we're trained to write very kind of almost kind of in a cold fashion, just lay those facts out there, just the facts, put it objectively. And really not in the kind of storytelling narrative way. So it took me a long time, frankly, to do this, because I really had to kind of lay it out the way I normally think about writing things and doing things, and then try to rework it and put it into a narrative, a story type of fashion, which was difficult for me. And it took a long time to get through that process, but I had some great people helping along the way, that were particularly non-lawyers who said, I don't understand all that, or that's all kind of going over my head. How can we say this more simply? So it was a long process, and one I was pretty nervous about starting when I first jumped in. But I think it ended up where I wanted it to be. So it was good.
Yeah, it really was. It was gripping. And one of the things that I was most impressed with was how you put us in your shoes. And by the way, you did it in a way. I've talked to people who know you, and this is just your nature. So it was probably easier for you to write like this than it would be for most lawyers. But you're a very good-natured, nice, humble, decent human being. So you did it. You showed us the sacrifices you made and the risks you took without sounding like you were bragging or I guess without sounding like a lawyer. I shouldn't put it that way, but you did it, and you did a great job. And I'm so glad you did, because I want to ask you a question about that. Before you knew the success you had, when you were facing those risks and really making real sacrifices, and we get a sense of it, but reading a book over several hours is not like living it over so many years. But still, we get a sense of that sacrifice and the risks you were willing to take to do the right thing and really to change the world. So I guess this is not a question about writing, but any advice to the rest of us on how we can encourage that in ourselves and in our practices, how to be that type of lawyer and that type of human being?
Well, it's one thing I've been mentioning lately when I talk about this whole story. Just, I guess, being willing to take a risk, being willing to step outside of the comfort zone, and say, gee, yeah, we've always done it this way, but what if we tried this? And be willing to do that. And when I'm talking with younger lawyers, I try to encourage that as well. Just take those opportunities as they come. And it may not be easy to do something different or to take a risk that way, but I'm a firm believer in if we can find new and innovative ways to bring a story out, bring the facts out to people, that eventually people will do the right thing. People will see the same facts and they will make the right decision. It might take a while to get there, but a lot of what I have been doing over the years, not just with the book, but the decision to do the films as well, and all, reaching out to the US EPA and different agencies, all of it has been sort of this kind of evolving approach of trying to find a better way to get a story out and to get facts out to folks that they understand why it's important. As lawyers, we're trained to do things a certain way through a certain court system, but that doesn't necessarily always translate to the scientists that are working on scientific papers, or to regulators or politicians, and into the public. So constantly trying to find different ways to bring this story and to tell the story and the facts such that people will finally start to grasp why this is an important issue, why this is something we should be paying attention to. And to me, it's been just fascinating over the last year or two to watch how, once those stories get told a slightly different way, through a film, through screenwriters, or through a book, the impact that can have. The different audiences, different people start to see this, and it's resulting in incredible change. We're seeing new laws being proposed, new regulations, new science. So it's encouraging. There were some times where we weren't sure whether that was ever going to happen, or whether things would ever move forward. But hopefully, when people look at this story, they realize it's worth the sacrifice. It's worth taking those risks, because it can result in some real positive change.
You mentioned the film. It was amazing how they did. What was it? An hour and a little more than an hour and a half, but I think it was less than 2 hours. They've got so much of the complicated history of the case into there, and how hard it was. It was a great movie. What was it? So you were involved in making that, right? Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, that was another fascinating process. As lawyers, it's not exactly the kind of thing we're trained to do. Sit down and write a book, or work with screenwriters and movie producers. But after that New York Times article came out in 2016, the one you mentioned, that laid out the story, Mark Ruffalo had seen that and reached out to me, because he was active in the environmental area and on water rights, and was just floored that how is something like this going on in the US, yet nobody's really talking about this. And it's in the New York Times Magazine, but why isn't it in the New York Times on the front page? Right, and how do we bring that story out? So, there were other studios that were reaching out as well, but I wanted to work with somebody that was committed to making sure the story came out and was told accurately and focused on the right things, showing what the community and what the people in those towns went through to get the story out. And Mark brought together the folks at Participant Media, Todd Haynes, the director, the incredible group that was passionate about doing just that, doing it the right way. Plus, I was able to consult on the script and help. I was there pretty much during most of the filming. A lot of it was filmed in our offices. So that was tremendous. I got to be able to sit, and particularly, for example, when they're filming a scene about a deposition, I'm deposing the CEO. Where do you sit? How is that done? They wanted to kind of do it as screaming and fist pounding, and I said, that's not the way we do it. That wasn't the point of why I was there. I was trying to convey to him, here's the information in your files, in a very objective, low-key way. And they changed that, and they did it correctly. They reframed the whole scene for the movie. So it was a great group that really was committed to doing the story and bringing it out the right way. And I think they did a great job doing it.
They did. All right, so I'm going to bring on now our three of our panelists. I'll give you a brief introduction, and for all of the panelists, feel free to interrupt me with better questions or different questions, and especially when you disagree with me, please make sure to say it. So first, we've got Gail Pearson. For more than 25 years, Gail has represented plaintiffs in all kinds of complex litigation, from environmental law to pharmaceutical cases to key Tom prosecutions. Before she became a trial lawyer, she studied laboratory medicine, physics, and chemistry. She spent years working at the USC Medical Center. She's a nationally recognized clinical laboratory scientist. She served as lead counsel in the certified class action against Philip Morris, and Supreme Court Justice Breyer presented her the Outstanding Pro Bono Service Award for her work on the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund. So we're going to bring Gail on. We're bringing Courtney Winston. She is the trial school's content committee chair. She's been an amazing part of building the trial school. She's an incredible lawyer. She, in terms of top shelf, she always reads the books and sends me questions to ask, really great questions, better than the ones that I was planning on asking. So we're excited to hear from her tonight. She practices in Virginia, and we have Lee Javins, who practices in West Virginia. I've seen him speak at conferences around the country. I've learned so much from him. He's really phenomenal trial lawyer. He handles all kinds of cases, product defects, heavy equipment, logging, coal mining accidents. He represents the state of Virginia kind of on a regular basis. He's on the AIEG Board of Governors, and I'm glad to have him today in part because he practices in West Virginia. So we're going to bring all of those great panelists on. And hey, guys, thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
So seriously, feel free to jump in, okay? And some of these questions I'm asking mainly to Rob, but then you guys may have answers that agree with him or complement that, and you may have further questions for him. But let me start with Rob. Why don't you tell us a little, very briefly, about where we stand today in regard to PFAS chemicals and what the future, what the threat we still face.
Sure, and good evening, all panelists. Good to see you. We have made some great progress, frankly, on PFAS just within the last couple of years. And in that regard, I mean, frankly, educating the public, educating legislators, regulators, scientists about what this stuff is, the nature of the threat, the scope of it, that we're dealing with a worldwide health and environmental threat. That's the good news, that the discussion has been elevated. We've even seen the president of the United States now talking about needing to address PFAS and allocating billions. But where we really still have the problem is with the ongoing regulatory legislative morass that we've been in for 20 years. And that's one of the things I wanted to deal with in the book is how can this be when you've got a chemical, let's take PFOA as example, that you've got some of the most comprehensive data existing, animal studies, human studies, toxicology studies, everything you could need to show you the harm from this chemical. Yet we are still working through this very slow process to get it regulated at the federal level. States are moving forward, but getting these things actually regulated, restricted, addressed in a comprehensive way under our federal law is still dragging along. And that's where we've got a real problem. We've still got major pushback by the industry, coming out saying we can't possibly regulate this. The entire economy will shut down. Life as we know it will end. So we've got that argument that's been frankly very successful for the last 20, 30 years. And we are slowly starting to see the momentum, I think, is there to get some of this to finally happen. And so having these discussions and having awareness of this, I think, is helping us move there. But right now we've got litigation all over the country. I know Gail knows about this as well. We've got water providers, states, people that are struggling with the cost and the damage that's been caused by this stuff being in our water. And right now, a lot of that litigation is focused on trying to make sure that companies that did this, knowing this would happen, that they're the ones who pay these costs. The 10 billion the president talks about needing to go to PFAS, that should be coming from these companies. So trying to make sure that the right parties now are held accountable. So you see a lot of debate going on back and forth in Washington, who's going to be held liable under which statute to do this. So it's happening, it's moving, and I think we're seeing some real positive change, and hopefully can kind of get it over the threshold to actually happen.
Gail, you want to add anything to that?
Thanks. And Rob and I met each other, 20 years ago, approximately, with the case we brought against 3M, and where I first met Rob, and he's one of the hardest working attorneys, and it's no surprise that this outcome is the way it has unfolded. When you have a chemical you can't see, you can't smell, you can't taste, And it's basically an invisible chemical. It's really hard, I think, for people to initially get their head around how this can be forever and how can it be harmful, because it's really hard to measure the impact. We actually tested the blood 20 years ago in the Washington County area, and we had elevated blood levels of this chemical in every single person we tested. Children were the highest levels, the elderly second highest, but they didn't feel it, and they didn't know they were drinking this. And so I think it took a long time to get from I don't see it, I don't hear it, I don't smell it, I don't taste it, with 3M, which is a golden child of Minnesota. It took a long time to convince the residents even that this is a problem. I think today still we've got a chilling effect because there's so much loyalty to these golden halo companies. So it's really, really tough. But I'll tell you, had Rob not been the type of person who's been so pleasant to work with, I mean, he just never had anything but a smile and a serious face, though, because we had a lot to do, but it was just a pleasure. And I'm just not surprised that we're here. I'm not surprised that it took us so long either, because folks just aren't willing to move on something they can't see, taste, smell, or feel the impact of it inside of them.
And I'll jump in on that. Was a great point, Gail. And I think one of the things that's really been positive that's happened because of that, because as you say, nobody could smell, taste, nobody could even pronounce this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Is in the last year or so, people have started using a phrase, forever chemicals. And that's actually had a huge impact in my view, because people understand what that means. And when they hear it, they understand why they should pay attention to it. Where these chemicals have had so many different names and so many incomprehensible names that made actually a big difference. Just finding a term to use that makes sense to folks.
I actually have started using forever chemicals for a different reason. I didn't want in front of Rob or Gail to mispronounce or one of the words or say PFAS when we should have been talking about PFOA. So I figure I'll just say forever chemicals and not embarrass myself.
Well, we know what you mean.
Yeah. But something Gail said, I think this would be a good for all the panelists. We can get a discussion going about this. And I was going to talk about it later, but since Gail brought it up about how long it took and the defense strategy, it seems to me the defense strategy in Rob's case, and I don't know that much about the Minnesota 3M case, but definitely the one in the book, the defense strategy was to overpower the plaintiffs with money and resources, to just crush you with like in the tobacco memo, not to spend all our money, but to make the other son of a bitch spend all theirs. It's a good strategy for defendants. Maybe it's immoral and unethical, but it does work a lot, sadly. But here I was just thinking, they didn't realize who they were up against, but if they had just paid Earl, if they'd paid even more than that, but a little bit at certain points, they'd have saved a fortune. And, there's a good chance I think we'd still be in the dark and the victims wouldn't know the truth if they hadn't been so scorched earth. They had just paid or done even if they didn't do the right thing, it was still a cover up, but they didn't try to take it. I mean, how much would it have cost to in the initial case? So I'd like to get all of your guys' thoughts on this defense strategy. I mean, does it sometimes backfire, and are we lucky that they put Rob through living hell?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, I guess, and then I'll be quiet so other people can talk. But you have to keep in mind, if you look back at the history here, 3M was a little clever, frankly. They, as soon as things started to trickle out to the agencies, they immediately pulled this stuff off the market back in 2000. And the US EPA at that point had essentially gone away. Nobody else knew this was happening. And if things had just stopped then, I don't think any of us would know about this. The problem was one of their big customers, DuPont, saw that as a market opportunity to jump in and start making this themselves. And, that's how the story then came out. And it was not even so much, yeah, you've got this defense approach, which I had been defending chemical companies, so I was familiar with it, of just flood them with paper, drag it out, make it as expensive as possible. And frankly, as I mentioned in the book, I think there are so many things that had to align the right way for this case to work out. And one of them was being at a firm that allowed me to go through that for that many years and all those resources. But also, I think one of the other big aspects of this was there was a level of corporate arrogance that was unmatched here. Okay. You had a company that didn't believe anybody could actually tell them, frankly, they were wrong, or that they believed they were they were science. And if DuPont said this is what the science is, you couldn't contradict them. Nobody could change that. And I think that level of arrogance that nobody would ever make them stop, nobody could ever tell them not to do this, persisted and got a lot of what we see ending up happened because of that.
We in our case in 3M, they were clever as well as arrogant, and one of their environmental managers, Cheryl Corrigan, convinced the governor to have her appointed as the Minnesota Pollution Control Commissioner. So she was overseeing this and really, clandestine, just covering up little spaces that the state might uncover some information. And I remember a war story, we were riding up in the elevator at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency with Cheryl Corrigan. She was the environmental manager at 3M. She was in charge of PFAS at 3M. And in the elevator, we knew who she was. We were polite to shake her, reach our hand out. And she said, "Oh no, my hands are dirty." And, so she wouldn't shake our hand, but I think it really spoke to, she knew, but she just felt that they were too clever to get caught. And
wait. Was that like a Freudian slip or something? My hand.
I think it was intentional. And I think that she just thought she was so smart that she didn't think we would catch the irony of her statement. But it was something that I just think it speaks to what Rob said, really their arrogance, and it continued. And it just, there'd be like, you're not gonna catch us, And so, literally it was that kind of stuff. And it took years to crack that.
Lee, what do you think? The fact that this was you had West Virginia judges, West Virginia plaintiffs, obviously Rob growing up spent some time in West Virginia. Did you think that DuPont just didn't realize what they were getting into, that West Virginia had some effect on this?
Well, it's interesting. I'll start by saying, Rob, thank you for your good work. I watched the movie before I read the book, and I knew for sure I assumed you were going to get fired by your firm. And I was really surprised. But anyway,
still there.
West Virginia seems to be a breeding ground for unfortunate events. We've had mine disasters, of which I've litigated any mine disaster in the last 20 years, including Upper Big Branch, 29 fatalities, Sago, 12 fatalities, so on and so forth. But one thing that really your good work reminds me of, and of course, every lawyer probably on this, not just on this panel, but anyone attending knows that they probably have their own war story where the defense could have gotten out so much earlier if they hadn't, tried to rub your nose in it. But your story reminds me a lot of a similar case where someone had dogged determination and knew that something wasn't right. And what I'm talking about is the opioid litigation. The genesis of that begins in Mingo County, West Virginia. There's a gentleman here in Charleston by the name of Jim Cagle. He's not a corporate, he doesn't do class actions. He's just a lawyer's lawyer. He'll take, try any case in a moment. You know the type, criminal defense, it doesn't matter. He's just a good lawyer. And he would be down in Mingo County and said, what are these lines at the drugstores on check day? And well, they're getting their opioids. That doesn't seem right. Something's wrong with that picture. How is it that the distributors And so he just started, not unlike yourself, Rob, he just started putting together the pieces and eventually took, got together with some friends like you did, in his case, and eventually took it to the Attorney General. And that's what began, that's the genesis of the opioid litigation. And it's since taken on a life of its own. And I helped Jim on the original opioid filings in West Virginia. We spent 5 or 6 years, not unlike yourself, trying to get someone across the country, guys, help us. We're onto something here. And everyone's like, no. All the players that are in this litigation now didn't want anything to do with it 6, 7 years ago. And so we were left fighting these companies, and they were rubbing our noses in it the whole way for about 7 years. And finally, we started getting some results because we had trial dates and a good judge. And so they could have resolved those cases a long time ago in West Virginia, and maybe nothing would have come of it. And so my point is, bad things tend to flourish in the dark, and it takes illumination, to sometimes like a disinfectant to do good. And so that reminds me of your good work reminds me of Jim Cagle's good work, and it has a much broader effect. So I'll just say, we've all got that story where the defense could have paid, but thank you for your good work, because for shedding light on an important topic. Thanks.
But is it happen? Does that good work happen more in West Virginia, or people? You got the judges, and I was struck. Look, you didn't grow up, Rob, in West Virginia, but clearly it's formed your personality in part. And I'm sure you realize. I hope you realize how rare the things you did on this case are. How few lawyers would have done what you did, and I don't know. It just feels like they were I don't think they were underestimating all plaintiffs' lawyers. I think they were misreading you, your strength. And I don't know. It feels like it has something to do with West Virginia, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, I don't know about the West Virginia angle of it, but we did end up in later years getting some of the internal memos that had been authored by the DuPont attorneys right when the case had been filed, and they were making choice comments about inexperienced Bilott, okay, not a trial lawyer. And I think they were just assuming, this is a defense guy, an environmental guy. He's not going to push this. That was the impression for a while. And, for the first year or two, definitely throughout the Mr. Tennett's case, we really were just dealing with their West Virginia counsel, their West Virginia law firm. And we continued to do that when we filed the class action. But as soon as that judge, started issuing sanctions against the company for discovery violations, making it clear. And by the way, we had originally filed in a different county in West Virginia because we didn't think we should be in Parkersburg. Okay, we had filed in Charleston, and DuPont brought us back to Parkersburg. But then they didn't like the judge because the judge started ruling against them. Suddenly, some large national law firms are brought in, Steptoe and Johnson, and folks like that. That suddenly the West Virginia folks are cut out. Because the local connections there simply weren't working with this judge.
All right, so maybe I was wrong about that, but it's still, I'm sure they were misreading you. Let me, and it's so interesting. You got to look at those internal memos. We rarely get a chance to see those. I'd love to see what if anyone said something about me in defense memos. So, and Courtney, jump in on this if you've got a question. I'm gonna ask a couple of things that some of our participants have started to talk about. We've got a question about Rob, how there was a loss of faith in the institutions that are supposed to be looking out for us. That there was a sense of that, at least one of our readers had. From reading the book, that you were having a loss of faith. I saw an interview of you with Mark Ruffalo. I guess it must have been on the movie, where you were asked whether the system is rigged, and Mark did all the talking. So I was curious to hear your answer. So is the system rigged in favor of big corporations?
I hate to sound cynical, but we've got some problems with the way all of this plays out, particularly in cases that involve people that are exposed to harmful things in the environment. All right, because then you're dealing with a system that was created to try to protect us from harmful chemicals. The regulatory system, the US EPA, those systems. You've got that intersecting with the way in which science is generated, how papers get published and peer reviewed, and who does that, and who does the peer review. Plus, then you've got our basic legal system and how burdens of proof come into play in these kinds of cases. And in a case like this, where you were dealing with an unregulated chemical, we had to fall back on good old common law tort concepts, okay? West Virginia actually had adopted a brand new tort claim of medical monitoring. It wasn't just a form of relief. They were saying, this is a new standalone tort. So when we're dealing with torts, when we don't have a statute that says this chemical is hazardous, and it doesn't matter how much or whatever, if you're above that level, that's a problem. In these tort cases, you have to prove injury and damage. And as a plaintiff, the exposed person, you're being told it's your burden to prove those things. And this case was a dramatic example of how that's almost impossible to do in environmental exposure cases, because the other side has all of the science. They have all the access to the data that you need. And we rarely have the kind of money that we ended up getting, only because we had a settlement that gave us $70 million in cash. But rarely do you have that money to do these big studies that the defense always says is necessary to prove the causal link. And you get this classic fight that always comes up every time about causation. Can the chemical cause harm at that dose level? And that is something that's almost impossible for exposed people to ever meet the burden of proof on. And so that's why, we stepped out of the system and created this new process of a science panel and independent studies in order to address what was going to be a huge problem with the way the legal system was set up. And so we stepped out, we created this system that filled in that hole, established general causation. Then we came back in and had 3,000 injury cases where we could use that. But I think it really highlighted, at least for me, how we've got this systemic problem with the way in which we deal with environmental exposures, how we prove that it's harmful or not, who's got the burden to do that, and the way the resources are allocated. And it does make it almost impossible for exposed people, in my view. And that's why I filed it, as I mentioned at the end of the book, I filed a new case where I'm trying to find a way to shift that burden back to say, if your company's putting this stuff out into the world and you are going to then say, yeah, but you can't prove what I'm putting out there is harmful. It ought to be your burden, you, the company, to pay for whatever studies have to be done to do that, because otherwise we can't do that. So I'm bringing that case. We just got certified as a class action on behalf of millions of people now that have this in their blood. But once again, we're having to go into the court system to try to meet these burdens while we're waiting for the regulatory process and the legislative process that would say this stuff's hazardous, regardless of what level, regardless of having to prove it's harmful or not. We're still waiting for that. So our only option is to go in and try to do these tort cases. And those burdens are incredibly difficult. So that's the system I think does need to be fixed.
We've got some questions that kind of follow up on what you were saying. It's hard enough to prove civil, but some people are asking, were there, weren't these criminal activities?
Well, I can tell you there was a Department of Justice started an investigation of DuPont in 2005. They actually came to our offices, and the DOJ did, to review all the files that we had from DuPont. But after DuPont cut a deal with the EPA in 2006, agreeing they would phase out any further manufacture over the next 10 years, all right, the DOJ quietly dropped the case. Nobody was ever prosecuted. And to this day, nobody at these companies have been prosecuted. 3M's paid a fine to the EPA. DuPont's paid a fine. There are investigations going on in Europe now. For example, in the Netherlands, and Belgium is now taking action. But in the US, no single person has ever actually been held accountable for any of this.
No, you said nobody was ever prosecuted. That could be the title of a chapter about so many corporate crimes. It really is crazy. Even when the company, there's some type of non-prosecution agreement. So they're essentially admitting criminal activity, but it's a non-prosecution agreement. So nobody's ever prosecuted or at least pleads guilty. All right. So
keep in mind, we had juries that actually said this company, DuPont, acted with conscious disregard of the risks here, and still nobody. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I just had a question about how you've kept your sanity through all this. I mean, your book was, I mean, it's true. The book, I think, is 380 so pages. And there were times when I was reading it and I was like, I have to put this down. Like, this is just, it's infuriating. It's frustrating. Like, so that's my question. Just how have you remained sane through these 20 years of fighting this company?
I had more hair. It was less gray, as Gail can attest to. But
we're very young then.
It was. I have to say, I mean, I kept kind of thinking back in the back of my head all throughout this. I would hear Mr. Tennant, frankly, saying, people need to hear this. People need to know this. And if you just take the time to look at this yourself, you'd see it too. And he was right. When I took the time to watch his videotapes, to go through these documents, it was clear to me what was happening. It was clear that there was a problem here. And throughout this whole process, despite all the legal gamesmanship and maneuvering that was going on in these cases and setbacks in our cases, I still would have in the back of my mind, if we can just find a better way to get that out. When people see this, they're going to see the same thing I'm seeing. And I think we're starting to see that now. It took a long time, but that's what kind of kept me, I guess, going, was knowing, I am convinced, based on what I've seen, that this is actually what's happening, that this is bad. There is a health threat here. This is something that needs to be addressed. I just need to find a better way to get this out to the public.
John, can I ask a question of Rob?
Sure.
Because it really, the lack of criminal prosecution based on, what I know, and Rob knows the world more than I know, is really, it's confusing. So do you think that this system of really the objective of the government is to bring these big corporations into compliance, right? Rather than punish and take them out of business. But whether you're in a nursing home or whether you're in, any type of government agencies, the objective is to bring the company into compliance. And that gives the company kind of an out where they know the worst is going to happen was they're going to eventually have to comply with the laws. Are you seeing that approach? Number one, are you seeing the approach of bringing someone into compliance rather than punishing them criminally? Of course, if it was a person on the street using drugs, they would be in jail, right? We're not going to talk about compliance for that person. But Rob, is there any role that this maybe we're going to bring them into compliance? They're an important aspect to our society, to our business, and we will be better off if they comply rather than if we punish.
Yeah. We definitely saw that with the PFAS cases. We saw that the US EPA was suing DuPont. They were claiming this had been withheld. This was a wrongful act that shouldn't have happened. They had all kinds of enforcement and other types of actions available to them that they could have taken. But instead, we saw what they kind of went out to the public and promoted was this concept that we got the companies to voluntarily come forward and agree not to make this stuff anymore. See, isn't that better that we all kind of work together to stop making more of this, we've achieved, a great benefit here for everyone without having to do all of that. And then they backed off, which it was great not to make any more of it. But unfortunately, it didn't address the fact that they'd already contaminated the planet and the stuff was still sitting in our water and our soil and our air, and they didn't address it. So, it was sort of, and we saw a memo produced in later years. It was called the Silver Bullet Memo, where DuPont's consultant, a former US EPA rep, who then went to work for DuPont, negotiated this deal, and it was seen as the silver bullet to give not only a DuPont a win, but the US EPA, because they were under pressure. Why didn't you see this before? Why didn't you act sooner? So this made it look as if to everyone there had been this great victory, and it had been done through a cooperative process. But the reality was, of course, nobody actually got punished, and everything stayed in the environment. There's been some great articles written recently. There was a Zingales out of University of Chicago and Harvard who looked at this case as a test study. And the whole concept that they addressed was it economically rational for a company like DuPont to do what they did, given the way this system's set up? And their conclusion was yes. Because if you look at the amount that they actually paid through settlements, almost $1 billion, or penalties, it pales in comparison to the amount of profit they were able to continue to make over those years. Nobody individually ever got held responsible. They ended up paying a fraction of that. And so it was economically rational for them to do what they did. And so people are now looking at that paper and others and are saying, shouldn't we be maybe trying to find a way to fix the system so that there's more deterrence to try to deter people from doing this, so it doesn't make economic sense to pollute the planet, pay a penalty, and go on.
Rather than saying, welcome to our group, you are now a stakeholder, so you get to have the conversation about how we're going to see your outcome in this process. I mean, they're now all called stakeholders.
Sorry, go ahead, Lee.
Well, just that business model is not terribly unique or original to the chemical industry. When someone goes to work at NHTSA, they work for a long time for government pay, and the retirement plan is when they're done, they go to work for one of the big three or one of the auto manufacturers. We see it in mining in West Virginia. The mining regulators, be it state or federal officials, when they put in their time, they go to work for a coal company as a safety executive. And so it's a pretty good business model where you have someone with legitimacy on the inside of your business to make sure things are done by the book. And then they use the relationships, and the people regulating these companies. The goal is to get a job with one of these companies at a later date. So it's a pretty good business model, really, when you think about it.
I'm gonna bring on our bartender. We usually take a break right about now, and we're running a little late on that. But so guys who are waiting for the drink, we're gonna bring that on. But I just wanna take 1 minute because Gail's initial question had to do with the government and how the government. And I have a more cynical answer, the possible answer, than Rob. So Rob was pointing out the economic incentives for the companies, how it still made economic incentive. But if we look at it a little cynically, why does the government act the way they do? I have two potential answers. There's a great book called The Chicken Shit Club, and it's based on a story that Jim Comey, when he was U.S. attorney, I think for the Southern District, it was in New York. He first day on the job, he called all the prosecutors into one room, and he said, everybody who's lost a case in the last few years, stand up. And hardly anyone stood up, couple of guys. And then he said, all right, now sit down, and everyone else stand up. And he said, welcome to the Chicken Shit Club, right? So it's bad for a prosecutor to lose a case, and these are hard cases. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I don't understand why the courts make it even harder. After Arthur Anderson, you still have the fear of maybe putting a company out of business and the prosecutor becomes the bad guy. But look at something like Enron. All those people who were prosecuted, in the end, the appellate courts, and my cynical explanation for that is, the defense attorneys, the corporate attorneys, let's call them, they're culturally similar to the judges. Our judges are largely brilliant. They go to the best schools, and these people, either they know from schooling, or they speak the same cultural language, and they just don't believe the companies are doing the things we know they're doing. So when you put those two things together, it's a career risk to actually push this. And they really don't believe that they're going to, they think, Rob, they think that you're, I don't want to, they if they read your book, they'd come up with all sorts of reasons to excuse DuPont. If you think about it from that point of view, that we're not trustworthy, right? Because we have an economic incentive. Some of the columns that were written about you in the West Virginia newspapers, right? That's a way of looking at life. And so unfortunately, that puts everyone in danger. So I'm sorry to be so cynical. We've got other questions, but let's take a quick 4-minute break. We do this very quickly. Let's bring on our bartender, Destiny. And while he's coming, I'll introduce our drink volunteers first. We have Jamie Finizio Bascom. She's a great trial lawyer who I've known for so long. It's crazy. She's president of the Broward County Bar Association. And like lots of trial lawyers, she's having her paralegal do all the hard work today. His name is Eduardo Girodot. So welcome, Eduardo. And we have Megan Cheney. She's a law professor, director of the Trial and Appellate Advocacy at NSU Law. She coaches the trial and moot court team, teaches some awesome law classes. They're going to make some drinks for us to all watch. And we've got our bartender, Destiny, who's been coming on for a couple of years. He owns some really cool bars in New York City. Let's see, is Destiny on? How you doing, Destiny?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to let you take it away. You've got 4 minutes to teach us how to make a drink. I'm going to turn off my video for 4 minutes so people can concentrate you. And I see Jamie is actually on, not her paralegal, but so let's see how you guys can make these drinks.
Wonderful. Tonight we're going to be making a Tommy's Margarita. It was created in the early 90s out in San Francisco at a bar called Tommy's Mexican Restaurant by a bartender named Julio Bermejo. And the difference between a classic margarita and the Tommy's Margarita is that there's no orange liqueur. Instead, we just use agave syrup. Now, from the recipe you've been provided with from Imbibe magazine, it's equal parts lime to agave syrup. Agave syrup is just water and agave that you buy in the raw that you buy at the store. Just 1-to-1, water to agave. I did 2 tablespoons of each. You mix it around and you have your agave syrup. Also, 1 lime usually juices about 1 ounce, which we'll only be needing about 3/4 of an ounce of it for our cocktail. And then you can use a Blanco or a Reposado tequila. I'll be using Blanco Pueblo Vallejo today. Is everyone ready? Wonderful. So first off, you're going to want ice. You're going to want your lime and something to shake it. So first off, we're going to start off with our lime juice. Imbibe magazine calls for 3/4 of an ounce or 2 tablespoons, depending on how you want to measure it. Personally, I like mine a little more tart, so I'm going to go 1 ounce. And there we are, measuring it out into your shaking apparatus. Mine is a classic Boston shaker. Let me tilt this down so you can see what I'm working with. There we are. Next up, our agave syrup, 3/4 or equal to your lime juice. Right in there as well. And then we're going to double and a little bit extra of our tequila, 2 ounces, which is the standard amount for just about every classic cocktail. How is everyone doing? I know I'm going fast because we only have 4 minutes, so let me know. Excellent. I hope everyone's good. Now we're going to seal our shaker and we're going to shake for about 20 seconds. Or until you start to get frost on your shaker. Hopefully it's metal if you're using a mason jar. Anytime you get the cold, and then when you shake, you want the ice not to be moving back and forth in a straight line. You want to move more in a serendipitous kind of way. And here we go. A nice 20 seconds of shake should do. And before we pour it out into our glass, what you can do, if you freshly squeeze some limes, you can take the leftover rind and rub it on the top of your glass, little moisture on there, and then a little plate of salt, dip it in. And now we have a wonderful salt rim on our glass. Add our ice. I like to use a Hawthorne strainer to keep the little bits of ice that I shook with out of my cocktail. And here we go. Your Tommy's Margarita.
All right, thank you. So you're
My
not at
pleasure.
your bar or one of your bars, you're working from home today.
Yes, working from home today because it's Cinco de Mayo and the bar is pretty busy and I wouldn't be able to set up there.
Thank you, Destiny. As usual is good. I don't try to make it in 4 minutes. I don't know who does, but I don't want it to take 2 minutes. You know, somebody was asking me the other day, why do we have a bartender? So I thought it was top shelf, like for the book club, but top shelf. I thought that was self-explanatory, but maybe I should explain. That's why maybe take a little break.
It explains itself to me.
I still haven't been up to New York to see one of your bars. We started during COVID. I said I was going to come, so I hope I will get up there.
Please do. Bandits in the West Village on 44 and Bedford Street.
All right, next time I'm up there. And our drink volunteers, thank you guys.
My pleasure.
All right.
Have a great rest of your seminar. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right, so Roland, let's go back to the original panelists. Roland is, as you know, controls the tech here. All right, so we've got some great questions. We got so many in the chat. I'm I'm not gonna be able to get to them, but you know, there's one that just jumped out at me. What do you and your family do to minimize your own exposure or risk with forever chemicals?
That's a great question. That's one I get a lot. And unfortunately, there's not much you can do. You know, and unfortunately, these things have not been they're not regulated. Still to this day, and we're starting to see that a little bit in some states, but it's not like you're going to see them on the warning labels or the ingredient labels on products. And we're only starting to really understand the full scope of the products that they've been used in over the years. You know, the ones that we already knew about, you know, like the Teflon cookware or the non-stick coatings, waterproof clothing, carpeting, that kind of thing. Frankly, we did get rid of our carpet. People asked me about that scene in the movie where we ripped all the carpet out. We went back to hardwood floors. You know, we avoid the non-stick cookware. Try to minimize, you know, the waterproofing and Scotch guarding and all that kind of stuff. But it's almost impossible. You know, the biggest source, of course, that you can control is your drinking water. And that's the primary source by which most people get this stuff into them and into their blood, is through drinking it. And unfortunately, we've found out that we've got, you know, I think I saw the Environmental Working Group estimate 200 million people just in this country have these chemicals that are being found in their drinking water. Now, a lot of it's being filtered out now, which is good. As the testing has finally started, we're seeing filtration systems go in. You know, Consumer Reports, though, just looked at bottled water and unfortunately found, you know, traces of this stuff even in the bottled water.
Wow.
So it's difficult to avoid it completely. But what you can do is at least start to be informed what types of products typically have had these things in them, and then you can try avoiding those. Stain-resistant waterproof clothing, carpeting, fast food wrappers and packaging, cosmetics that are waterproof. You know, there's a lot of it. But there are organizations now out there like the Green Science Policy Institute and others that are identifying the different categories of products where the chemicals have been used. And they're helping provide ways, these different groups of reaching out to the companies for people to petition them and say, we don't want you using these anymore. And we've seen, even though we don't know who's using it and how much is in what, there are a number of companies that have been coming out recently voluntarily announcing that they're phasing these things out. big fast food companies have made those announcements. Some of the big clothing retailers, some of the cosmetic companies. So, you've got to, unfortunately, do a lot of work as a consumer to find out what types of products have they been used in, and then try to, at least you can start making the choice to avoid it. Because up to now, none of us had that ability to make that choice. But it's not easy. And we're trying to the extent we can to avoid the things we already know they're in. But unfortunately, as PFOA and PFOS, the closely related Scotchgard chemical, have been phased out, we've seen new safe replacement chemicals coming out from these same companies that unfortunately are part of the same chemical family. And so they're still the forever chemicals that are being used in these same products now. So you see, and I'll be quiet, but you see there's states, for example, California just adopted a law saying you can't come out and advertise your product as PFOA free because it's misleading. People don't realize it may have the other ones in it, PFAS. Wow. So it's very difficult as a consumer to make those choices at this point.
I'll add a couple of things to what Rob just said. Microwave popcorn is not permitted in our house. That was a big thing. I think I microwave popcorn my life through law school, so that's not permitted. When I go to fabric stores or upholstery stores, I make a scene kind of. So if I see stain resistant anything, I'm right away up to the counter saying, what does this mean? And so I make a scene because I think I'm not only going to educate my family, but anyone that has to deal with me in commerce is going to hear about my concern with these chemicals. If you go to Williams-Sonoma and they have all these PFO-free tags, I'm up there at the counter and educating not only the person I'm speaking to, but everyone in the store hears me too. So I do a little commercial about what this is a concern and we need to be worried about. And in states, Minnesota, in fact, is trying to enact a requirement to label any PFAS products. But there is ways, as Rob said, go on, environmental working group. There are ways to go online to see where you can be exposed. Even I think Oral-B dental floss has PFAS in it. So I do try to avoid it, but Rob's right. Until we get the chemical labeled, we can't. And I don't like those shorter chains. I think they're, to me, it sounds like we've got some problems with the shorter chains chemicals as well.
And why should they test them on us, to find out? So I've got about three general questions left. The first two really, I think, they're about these chemicals, but they're also, I'm interested in your thoughts on what this means for the type of country we're going to live in and our safety going forward and the power of corporations. And so the first one, this is reading from the book. The company now knew PFOA had made its way into the community's drinking water. The business, I'm summarizing a little bit, but most of this is quoting. The business leaders were less concerned about, they were concerned that a less toxic replacement chemical was still speculative and that by eliminating PFOA, they would, quote, essentially put the long-term viability of the business segment on the line. I blinked hard and looked again to see if I'd read that right. There was a consensus reached that, quote, the issue which will decide future action is one of corporate image and corporate liability. Liability was defined as the incremental liability from this point on if we do nothing, as we were already liable for the past 32 years of operations, end quote, those quotes being from the memos. And Rob writes, in other words, why forgo a hugely profitable business segment, they seem to be asking, if you were already on the hook for 32 years of pollution? And so DuPont continued not only to keep using PFOA, but actually increased its use and emissions dramatically after they knew the danger. And that is the economic right thing to do, right? If all you care about is profit. So, I mean, is every business doing this? Rob, you talked about that, how, it's self-policing and self-reporting, and you got a sense that there's something wrong with the system.
Yeah, and I guess the problem is we don't know. And we know about this just because Mr. Tennant's cows were dying. And we ended up getting these memos and actually seeing this kind of stuff. I mean, these were memos that were actually put together of this decision-making process. And these same memos were the ones that were shown to the juries, and then we showed them the graph showing after that, the emissions going steadily up into the environment. That's how you get hit with punitive damages when juries see things like that. But, we don't know. We don't know what decisions like this are going on in boardrooms. Unfortunately, hopefully, this isn't a widespread practice, but you've got this problem, and when you've got this concept. And I was just listening to a show, I think it was on NPR just a couple of days ago. They were talking about the history of where this concept of shareholder value, that you have to be, as a company, your purpose is to increase shareholder value and to make profit. And the whole discussion was that's not necessarily true. That you don't have to. There's nothing in the law that says that you have to be making, but there's this concept. That the company says, well, we've got to do this, otherwise the shareholders will be mad because it's not regulated. So why would we give up all of this profit if we're not being required to do it? It's incredibly frustrating to see that. And we actually have been getting called, since this story came out, by other companies that want to learn from this because they want to make sure that this doesn't happen. How do we avoid a decision like that going on within our company? So I think that's a good sign that other companies are wanting to learn from this, which would suggest that's not the way they behave. But I think, unfortunately, when you're in this world, this kind of odd world of unregulated chemicals where it isn't legally required that you do these things, you have this tension then that comes up between the corporate folks that are saying we can make more money doing this and the lawyers who can't say, well, you're not legally required. It was remarkable to see that back and forth, to see it actually in writing, and to see how it ended up, that the corporate guys won that battle.
Yeah, so I didn't read that part, but in case anyone forgot, the part that I read, what I skipped when I was reading it to you was that the legal and medical parts of the company were pushing for them to take the product off the market. Lee, were you going to add something?
Well, actually, I was thinking because it's probably a good book in its own right. Someone's written about this because I've read it, but probably in journal articles, and that is somewhere maybe in the 80s, one or all of the preeminent business schools kind of changed the dynamic and said to their students, your number one goal
exactly
is to maximize the shareholder value. And that's where we got here. And that didn't used to be taught at the business schools, but somewhere around the 80s, that became a thing. And here we are. That's all I was going to add.
Yeah. Yeah. It was started in economics, and it infiltrated the law too, through law and economics theories. Lots of very wealthy corporations and billionaires contributing to certain law schools to create. And so lawyers are being taught this idea that judges now who are deciding decisions are looking not to morality, but to what is most economically efficient. And, it may not be in the opinion, but some of the judges may be thinking, based on this new way of thinking that started coming around in the 80s, that maybe some people are going to die of these forever chemicals, but the country's going to have a higher GDP, and it's going to be too expensive to eliminate them. And, for us, for a lot of us, that we think nobody would think that way, but they actually write about how that's how the decision should be. they do think that way. They admit it. They don't think there's anything to be embarrassed about that.
Well, it's remarkable. You see that exact argument being made right now in newspapers across the country. As I mentioned earlier, as we see legislation being proposed now at the federal level to finally start to rein in these chemicals, we now have sort of these talking point editorials that are appearing in newspapers. And we've seen this tactic before, where you come up with these very succinct talking points and then push them out to newspapers. And right now, the big argument is, oh, gee, if you crack down on these PFAS chemicals, it's going to eliminate your 5G networks, your cell phones, COVID masks, life-saving equipment, and for our economy to prosper and for things to move forward, particularly as the economy is starting to cool off a bit. The last thing we could possibly do is start to crack down on these chemicals because they're vital to our economy. So it's that argument being pumped out right now, and because it's worked for many, many years.
Yeah, the second of the three last topics I want to talk about is related. I thought I couldn't have a worse view of I don't think they're cartoon villains, right? But there was one point in your book where I started to think maybe they are like cartoon villains. But you somehow got a copy of the proposal to DuPont from the Weinberg Group, and they're bragging about how these horrible things like Agent Orange. They're bragging about how they had successfully basically avoided liability for companies. They dealt with the regulatory litigation and PR challenges posed by those whose agenda is to overregulate, extract settlements from, or otherwise damage the chemical manufacturing industry. And they say, these are quotes, they're going to take control of the ongoing risk assessment by the EPA. And how are they going to do it? I mean, you don't even have to read between the lines too closely. They're going to fucking invent fake articles, fake scientific, and just to fool the EPA. So you wrote the audacity was astounding. And, for you, that was very direct, and, you're very level-headed in everything you were writing. But I mean, it's even more disturbing than that, isn't it? I mean, people are going to die, and they're going to make up, they're going to ruin our science. I mean, it's going to screw up everything about what are scientists going to rely on?
Well, that particular memo was another one of those where you thought you'd never see something like that actually written out. And there it was, the game plan, how we're going to basically manipulate the science, take control from the judges, from the regulators, and just all laid out. And we've done it before with these other chemicals and these other products. And, for a long time, DuPont was denying that they ever retained that company. And it took us actually showing them the invoices, all right, that were paying them when they finally stopped denying that they had retained that company. And they did the things that we see in that memo. I mean, believe it or not, despite everything that was finally shown about the toxicity of this chemical, these folks went out and actually conducted human studies, and then came forward and started to try to argue. And we've seen this now presented to courts, and the same consulting firm that worked with them, with the state of West Virginia, to set up this bogus drinking water number 10 years ago, started working with them to try to publicize the fact that the chemical PFOA could actually be used to help and cure cancer. It's mind-blowing. But when you look back at this memo, that's precisely what they were trying to do, was find a way to argue this stuff's actually good for you. And they're actually trying to do it. I say the audacity was astounding there, but since then, it's been remarkable to me that it's continued. It continues to this day. It's amazing. But I think it continues because it's been working.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'll have to say, when I worked in the laboratory, the very first day of our class in clinical chemistry was a picture of a beaker, and it was got fluid in it, and they put a mouse inside the fluid, and the mouse was able to swim around and not use oxygen because it could use the chemical, and it ended up being a perfluorochemical inside that. And they were discussing how this life-saving chemical could now replace the need for blood on the shells, because we could actually put it into human bodies as a substitute for blood products. And that was the very first day. And that, I mean, that was
Wow.
many, many, many years ago, but that's how long ago they started this campaign about this is a life-saving business. And it was amazing. The mouse swam under the fluid and didn't need to breathe at all. And we were just like, oh, what a great, life-saving thing. And then I learned the secrets later on. So.
Well, the one good thing about the book, I should have read the part when, and I'm glad Rob mentioned it. The legal department, the lawyers, and these were on the defense, were arguing to do the right thing, and that does give me hope. You could look at it like the scientists have been infected by this legalistic way of thinking and like just win at any cost, an adversarial system, and that's bad. But actually, people with legal training were arguing to do the right thing. So that does give me some hope, although I do fear for our future and my kids. And this was one great victory in one battle, Rob, and thank God you did it. But like you said, you didn't say it in this way, but there's only so many lawyers like you, and they were likely to have gotten away with this. They did make money, even though you caught them, even though you beat them. This was still the financially smart decision to do, but they almost got away completely. And they were likely to do so. And I think that's going on in a lot of other industries, unfortunately. All right, one last question. It's from one of our participants. When does your wife receive sainthood?
That's
I think she's already got it. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you talk about all the things that had to be in place and in line for all of this to have worked out the way it did. And that's definitely one of them. Being married to somebody like Sarah and, having that support and somebody that understands what's going on. And that was incredible.
If anyone knows the official way to fill out whatever forms you have to propose someone for sainthood, I would propose you to. Seriously, thank you to the panelists. I couldn't do this without you guys, because it'd be too boring for me to just say ask questions. And so thank you, panelists. I really appreciate you guys being on and all the insight and everything you bring to it. And Rob, thanks for being on. Thanks for talking to us, enlightening us, and especially for writing the book, and I guess really for doing what you did.
Well, thanks so much. And again, thanks to everybody on the panel too. It was great talking with all of you. Thanks to everybody watching. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody, we'll do this again. Be on the lookout for when we announce the next one. It's too much to do every month or even every 2 months, because people got to read the books. It's fun. I always reread the book leading up to it, because it's fun to get all the emails with people as they're reading it, for me to go through it with you guys. So keep that up. Be on the lookout for our next one. And thanks to everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.